The chapter in the textbook on legal issues is excellent, and I struggled and decided not to have you read it, not because it's not excellent, it is, it's almost too excellent. What I mean by that is it really gives a very thorough of legal issues to include particularly taxation issues deeper than to be honest, I understand a lot of the issues that they're raising in the textbook. So if you have time, by all means, read it, but I'm going to try to just briefly touch on some of the legal issues in addition to the intellectual property chapter. Hiring a lawyer is tricky. For me personally, for no other reason than, man, they're really expensive. Um, but you do probably, if you're going to grow a serious business, you're going to need an excellent lawyer. And just like you don't see a cardiologist for a skin issue, you don't just go see any lawyer for any issue. Lawyers have particular expertise, and you're going to want to make sure that the lawyer has the expertise in the areas that you need to be involved. Also, a lot of business law is state law, not federal law. So you often have to have a lawyer in that state or is familiar with the practices in that state, or what they're going to provide for you isn't going to fit. One of the other tricky things about a lawyer is that it's hard to know their quality, um, particularly if you're using them to draw up documents and the like. If I go to a restaurant and have a meal, I get instant feedback on how good the chef is. I get instant feedback on how good the service is. If I have a lawyer draw up a contract, for example, or draw up a liability kind of waiver, I only really find out how good that lawyer is until there's problems. And so that's another part of the difficulty of finding a lawyer. And lastly, how do you find one? Well, this is where a referral network is very helpful. This is where having investors who've used business lawyers are very helpful. The Small Business Development Center, professional friends, accountants, and the like, all those are good referrals to try to find the right lawyer. But you have to gulp a little bit because their hourly rates can be pretty eye-popping. But when you have a complicated issue, they're worth it. In particular, I think a patent lawyer is essential. The number one issue that a lot of people struggle with is this idea of what legal entity, if any, do I form for my company? So you'll have these slides on D2L. This is out of an undergraduate textbook I use, which is an outstanding summation of the pros and the cons of the various forms that entrepreneurs use to run their business. On the left side of the slide is a sole proprietorship. Numerically, this is what most people do. A lot of the businesses you see running around Wichita Falls, they're sole proprietorships. The advantage of it is it's very straightforward. Usually legally what's needed to be done is pretty minimal. Things like getting the right licenses, perhaps getting tax IDs, filing doing business as with the counties and the cities. There's some paperwork there. But other than that, there are no recurring costs. Very straightforward. The big drawback to the sole proprietorship is that there is no legal separation between you, the business owner, and your business when it comes to liability issues. I had a student in one of my early classes here tell me a horrible story where a family that was operating a business as a sole proprietorship had a son that was driving one of the company trucks that killed someone else, killed or severely injured someone else, and the family was the person that was killed or injured, their family was taking them to court. And because it was a sole proprietorship, the family was trying to draw the boundaries at the business and trying to use their business insurance to cover their liability. And apparently this family was fairly wealthy, and the plaintiffs were not going for that at all. They were going for the whole enchilada. They were going for all the family's personal holdings and everything, because they said even though the son was an employee and even though it was in a company truck, it was really a family deal, and they're trying to go all the way across. There are some other things that are challenges with sole proprietorships: harder to raise money, you can't really take in investors, and it is just that, sole, single, solitary. So because of that, you have partnerships. Now the slide is mislabeled where it says proprietorships across the top. That should say partnerships. A partnership is a lot like a sole proprietorship. It's just with two or more people. Now you can get into the idea of a limited partnership, and this is critical because in a limited partnership, the general partners have unlimited liability, but the limited partners don't. And typically limited partners are just investors. The best example for this class of a typically a limited partnership is a venture capital fund. Usually the venture capitalists are the general partners, and the investors are limited partners, so they don't carry, they do have limits on their liability to their investment. So an advantage with a partnership is you get more than one person, um, but the main drawback is you still, with the exception of the general partnership, if you were a limited partner, you still have unlimited liability. So then you move into the corporations. Well, the corporations, the strength of a corporation is that it's a separate legal entity. So now if it's going to be sued, they sue the corporation. For example, as I'm making this, GM is struggling with recalls on their cars. Notice that nobody's suing the CEO, Mary Barra. They're suing GM, the corporation. Well, that's because GM is a separate legal entity. So the strength of a corporation is the liability protection that it affords. The challenges of a corporation is it takes money to set one up, and you have to do a lot of paperwork to keep it ongoing. You have things to file. But the biggest bugaboo you'll hear about is this idea of double taxation. And so everybody will say double taxation. And the idea on that is that the corporation pays income tax. And then if they pass the profits on to their shareholders as dividends, the dividend holders have to pay tax on that as well. So it's double taxation. In the standpoint of small family, particularly small family-owned startups, this really isn't an issue though. And let me just quickly illustrate two reasons why, or two ways it's not an issue, and how sometimes small companies use this to their advantage. The first is, how much does the CEO get paid? If it's a small privately held company like a family business, well, it can go from a little to a lot. So you could, again, in consultation with your tax attorney or your tax accountants and the like, you could leverage the CEO's pay up a whole lot so that the corporation showed very little profit and had very little tax to pay on that profit. So there's shifting that can be done internally. The other thing is a story that it's one of those where I didn't think about this. You ever wondered why a lot of the conventions for businesses are in really cool places like Disneyland, Disney World, Hawaii, and the like? Well, let's imagine that you have a family-owned business, but as a C corporation, you have to have a board of directors, and it just so happens the board of directors is your spouse, your parents, your in-laws, which is to say you really don't have a board of directors at all. But you decide you're going to have your annual meeting of the board of directors at the annual convention for your particular industry, which just happens to be in Hawaii. So can you charge as a company expense everybody's airfare to Hawaii? Yes. Can you pay for their hotel rooms? Yes. Can you bring your kids? Yes, but you've got to pay your airfare, their airfare. So a good tax accountant will help you structure this deal so that you basically can take a family vacation and write it off as a business expense. So that deal is not as big as you think. Plus, you have the option of creating an S corporation. And that's just another type of corporation, but you'll see on the slide it has a lot of limitations on the shareholders, and the advantage of an S corporation is you can have pass-through taxation, which is to say you don't file a tax return for the corporation. All of the profits flow through to the shareholders, and they are taxed on their income. And then lastly is a relatively recent creation called an LLC. These are, for the most part, state laws, and they try to combine the best of both worlds. LLCs have liability, some liability shield because it's a separate legal entity. It has pass-through taxation, or you can, if you set it up right, have pass-through taxation. But yet you can create members in some structure that's less onerous than a corporation, but still there so that you could have investors and the like in that. So the LLC is a hybrid. Today, if you look at a lot of startups, when they take a legal entity, it's often an LLC. You got a lot of more stuff to read online, but I wanted to introduce you to the major issues and why people do what they do with these things.